pyramids of Tizca were not built of stone, but of crystal and song. They resonated with a low, psychic hum that was the lifeblood of the world, a constant and gentle pressure against the minds of its inhabitants, a reminder that thought itself was the primary architecture of reality. Within their crystalline halls, light was not merely illumination. It was data, it was history, it was the raw, untranslated language of the cosmos. Men and women walked the plazas of the City of Light not merely to transact business or seek pleasure, but to learn by osmosis, to breathe in the ambient knowledge that saturated the very air. This was Prospero, the jewel of a forgotten corner of the galaxy, a world dedicated not to conquest, but to understanding. And watching over it all, from the summit of the Pyramid of Photep, were its masters and guardians, a legion of warriors who had transcended the crude necessities of blade and bolter. They were the 15 Legion. They were the 1,000 Suns. To the wider Imperium, they were an enigma, a cadre of scholar mystics clad in the ceramite of space marines. They were librarians and philosophers first, soldiers second. Where other legions measured their worth in conquered worlds and slain enemies, the 1,000 Suns measured theirs in translated xenocodices, in rediscovered archaeotech, in the charting of the unseen currents of the galaxy. Their Primarch, the Cyclopean Magnus, was a being of intellect so vast, it was said he could perceive the crystalline lattice of space-time itself. He had taught his sons that the greatest weapon was not the sword, but the mind. He had shown them the great ocean, the immense psychic sea that underlies all of material reality, and he had taught them to navigate its tides with discipline and caution. They were not sorcerers trafficking with demons, as their detractors whispered. They were scholars of the soul, pioneers of humanity's next great evolutionary frontier. They were loyal, not just to the emperor as a ruler, but to the very ideal of illumination that the Great Crusade was meant to represent. The dream of an enlightened, rational humanity was not an abstract concept on Prospero. It was the very foundation of their world. Yet this was their sin. In an age of iron and fire, they pursued light. In an era that demanded obedience, they sought understanding. They saw the warp, not as a realm of inherent damnation to be universally shunned, but as a fundamental force of the universe, like gravity or electromagnetism, dangerous, yes, but comprehensible, and ultimately controllable. They believed that to fear knowledge was the highest form of ignorance, a betrayal of the human intellect the emperor sought to champion. This was the chasm of understanding that separated them from their brothers. While Leman Russ of the Zix Legion saw the warp as a tainted forest full of monsters to be slain, and Mortarion of the Death Guard saw it as a witch's cauldron of poison to be abhorred, Magnus the Red saw it as an ocean to be sailed. This singular difference in perspective, this philosophical divide, would cost them everything. It would be the kindling upon which their entire civilization was burned, not by a foreign enemy or a malevolent power, but by the very brothers they had fought alongside to build a galactic empire. The tragedy of Prospero was not that a legion fell to chaos. The tragedy was that a loyal legion was annihilated for a truth their murderers were too blind to see. The foundation of this tragedy was laid not on the battlefield, but in a council chamber. The Great Crusade was a venture of unprecedented scale, a reunification of humanity's scattered worlds under a single banner of secular reason. But as it expanded, it encountered phenomena that defied simple material explanation. It encountered psychers, individuals whose minds could bend reality, and it encountered the insidious whispers of the warp from which their power flowed. To many of the Primarchs, these were witches, abominations, liabilities that threatened the logical purity of the Imperium. The debate festered for decades, a philosophical poison spreading through the ranks of the Emperor's sons. It was a debate about the very soul of humanity. Was the psychic gift a glorious future to be embraced, or a corrupting cancer to be excised? The Emperor, ever distant, allowed his sons to argue, perhaps believing the correct path would emerge from the crucible of their conflict. It was on the world of Nikaea that this debate reached its terrible conclusion. In a great amphitheater, under the silent gaze of the Emperor himself, Magnus the Red stood as the sole advocate for the Librarius project, for the controlled, disciplined study of psychic power. He argued with a passion born of certainty. His vast intellect, laying bare the fallacies and fears of his opponents. He spoke of control, of enlightenment, of the necessity of understanding an enemy to defeat it. He warned that to blind themselves to the warp was not to protect the Imperium, but to leave it defenseless against threats it could not comprehend. Against him stood the superstition of Mortarion, who had seen the horrors of warpcraft on his benighted homeworld of Barbarous, and the brutal pragmatism of Leman Russ, who saw any power not born of muscle and steel as a dishonorable trick. The tide of opinion was against the Crimson King. The fear of the unknown was a far more potent force than the promise of knowledge, and so the Emperor, the master of mankind, rendered his judgment. The Edict of Nikaea. The Librarius project was to be disbanded. The legions were forbidden from employing psychers in battle. The study of the esoteric was declared anathema. To Magnus and his 1,000 sons, it was a crippling blow. It was a decree that ordered a man with sight to blind himself, for fear of what he might see in the dark. Yet, Magnus complied. The surviving records are clear on this point. He knelt, and he accepted his father's judgment. He returned to Prospero, not in rebellion, but in sorrowful obedience. He ordered his legion to ground its powers, to cease their great work, to let their unique talents atrophy. This was the ultimate test of his loyalty, and he met it. He chose to obey his father's flawed command over his own superior understanding. He placed his trust in the Imperium's wisdom, even when that wisdom was a product of fear. It was this act of profound loyalty, this deference to the Emperor's will, that sealed his doom, for in blinding his legion, he left them vulnerable. And in trusting his father, he failed to account for the treachery of his brothers. The central, unbearable complication was born of this loyalty. Confined to Prospero, Magnus turned his formidable mind inward and toward the great ocean, not in defiance, but in quiet contemplation. He still watched the currents of fate, the grand tapestry of causality that his mind could perceive, and it was there, in the silent depths of the Imperium, that he saw the cataclysm. He saw his most beloved brother, the War Master Horus Lupercal, brought low on the sands of Davin. He witnessed the arch-traitor's infection, the poison of chaos seeping into his soul, twisting his ambition into a galactic cancer. He saw the future, a galaxy consumed by fire and civil war, a future where brother would slaughter brother and the Emperor's dream would be reduced to ash. He saw everything, and his knowledge became his burden. He was bound by the Edict of Nikaea. He was forbidden from using the very powers that had granted him this terrible foresight. To communicate it through conventional channels, to send an astropathic message or dispatch a fleet, would take months, perhaps years. By then, it would be too late. The poison would have taken root. Horus would have consolidated his power. The rebellion would be unstoppable. Magnus was faced with an impossible choice. Obey the letter of his father's law and allow the galaxy to burn, or break his oath to save it. For a being dedicated to logic and the greater good, there was no choice at all. The preservation of the Imperium outweighed any personal vow or decree. He had to warn the Emperor, and he had to do it immediately. And so, he gathered the most powerful of his corvidae, the precognitive members of his inner circle, and prepared for the greatest act of psychic intrusion ever attempted. He would not send a message. He would deliver it himself. He would project his astral form across the entire galaxy, through the raging tempests of the warp, and manifest directly within the Imperial Palace on Terra. It was an act of staggering arrogance, a feat of psychic power so immense as to be almost inconceivable. But it was also an act of desperate filial love. He would break his father's law to save his father's life. He would risk damnation to prevent annihilation. The records are silent on the precise rituals he performed, but they speak of the sky over Tizca, turning to bruised purple, and the crystal pyramids, screaming with psychic energy. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, cast his soul into the great ocean, a lone swimmer against a tidal wave of damnation, his destination the throne world itself. He did not know that in his desperation he was not merely breaking a law, but shattering the very shield that protected his father's greatest work. The Emperor's Webway project was the ultimate culmination of his grand design. Deep beneath the Himalayan mountains, he had been constructing a new artery for galactic travel, a safe passage through the labyrinthine dimensions of the Eldari, free from the storms and predators of the warp. It was the key to humanity's future, the final step in divorcing mankind from its reliance on the Imperium and its capricious gods. The project was shielded by psychic wards of unimaginable power, a bulwark of pure will, woven by the master of mankind himself. It was into this shield that Magnus, in his astral form, collided. He was a battering ram of pure thought, a loyal son screaming a warning of betrayal, but to the palace's defenses, he was simply an intruder, an attack of unprecedented force. He did not relent. He could feel the resistance, the psychic friction that threatened to annihilate his very consciousness. But the vision of Horus's treason burned behind his single eye. He pushed harder, pouring more and more of his legion's collective power into the assault. With a final catastrophic effort, he broke through. The Emperor's psychic shield shattered like a pane of glass. For a moment, Magnus stood in the heart of his father's secret laboratory, the golden light of the nascent webway gate, bathing him in its glory. He saw the Emperor upon his golden throne, not as a king but as a craftsman, his attention fixed upon the intricate machinery of humanity's salvation. And then, through the breach Magnus had torn, the things of the warp came flooding in. Demonic entities, psychic predators held at bay for decades, poured into the pristine tunnels of the webway, turning the Emperor's secret hope into a howling gateway to hell. Magnus delivered his message. He screamed of Horus's betrayal, of the fleets being mustered, of the oaths being broken. He laid the truth bare at his father's feet. But the Emperor did not see a loyal son delivering a vital warning. He saw a fool who had, in an act of supreme hubris, just destroyed his life's most important work. He saw a disobedient child who had unleashed damnation at the very heart of the Imperium. The warning was lost in the context of the crime. The damage was done. The psychic shock wave of the ward's collapse echoed through the warp, a dinner bell for the ruinous powers. The Emperor was forced to abandon the final stages of the project and commit himself to the Golden Throne, not as its master, but as its prisoner. Forever bound to a war against the demonic tide Magnus had unwittingly unleashed. His response to his son was not one of gratitude, but of cold, terrible fury. The Crimson King was cast out, his astral form shredded, his connection to his father severed. He awoke back on Prospero, his body racked with pain, his mind reeling from the psychic backlash and the chilling silence from Terra. He had tried to save the Imperium, and in doing so, had damned himself and mortally wounded his father. On Terra, the die was cast. The news of Magnus's psychic intrusion, stripped of all context and nuance, was presented as the ultimate act of treachery. Horus, the true traitor, saw his opportunity. He whispered in the ears of the imperial court, fanning the flames of fear and anger. He painted Magnus not as a desperate messenger, but as a malevolent sorcerer who had attempted to assassinate the Emperor with warpcraft. The Crimson King's esoteric reputation, his legion's strange ways, the long-held suspicions of his rivals, it all coalesced into a single damning narrative. The Emperor, trapped on the Golden Throne, his psychic energies now wholly dedicated to fighting the war within the webway, gave his order. Leman Russ and his Zix Legion, the Space Wolves, were to be dispatched to Prospero. Their original mandate, as dictated by the Emperor, was to bring Magnus back to Terra in chains to account for his actions. It was to be an arrest, a censure. But these orders did not travel directly to Russ. They were relayed through the office of the War Master. And Horus Lupercal, the Master Manipulator, made a single critical alteration. The message that reached the Wolf King was not to arrest his brother, but to execute him. It was not to censure the 1,000 Sons, but to annihilate them. The order was simple and brutal. Destroy Prospero, slay the 1,000 Sons, burn the City of Light to the ground. Leman Russ, who had long harbored a deep-seated distrust for his sorceress brother, did not question the command. He was the Emperor's executioner, and he had just been handed his axe. He gathered his legion, the warriors of Fenris, and he was joined by the silent specters of the Sisters of Silence and a full contingent of the Legio Custodes, the Emperor's own bodyguard. This was not a censure host, it was an extermination fleet, and it set a course for Prospero, its purpose not justice but obliteration. On Prospero, a profound and terrible stillness had fallen. Magnus, broken by his failed attempt to warn his father, had retreated into seclusion within his pyramid. He had foreseen the consequences of his actions, the terrible misunderstanding that was now barreling across the galaxy towards his home. He knew a fleet was coming. He knew it carried his brother, Russ, but he could not bring himself to believe its purpose was annihilation. It was a punishment, surely, a reprimand for his transgression, but not destruction, not the murder of a loyal legion. And so he gave his final fatal order to his sons. They were to offer no resistance. He commanded the legion's fleet to stand down. He ordered the planetary defense grid, one of the most sophisticated in the Imperium, to be powered down. He psychically blinded his Corvidae seers so they could not witness the impending horror and be tempted to act. He believed that by accepting his punishment with grace and humility, he could prove his loyalty and avert the worst of his father's wrath. He would show them they were not monsters by refusing to fight. The fleet arrived without warning. One moment the skies of Prospero were a familiar, tranquil blue. The next, they were blotted out by the slate-gray hulls of the Vixi Legion. Hundreds of warships translated from the warp in perfect, brutal synchronicity, a ring of iron closing around the defenseless world. No hailing frequencies were opened. No demands for surrender were issued. There was only silence, a cold, predatory silence that was more terrifying than any war cry. From the observation decks of Tizca, the Thousand Suns watched as the orbital bombardment began. The sky tore open. Lance batteries, like the vengeful fingers of a wrathful god, stabbed down from orbit, their beams of incandescent energy vaporizing entire districts in fractions of a second. The crystalline pyramids, which had stood for centuries as monuments to knowledge, shattered into trillions of glittering shards. Libraries containing priceless, irreplaceable texts from a million worlds were incinerated. The civilian population of Tizca, the scholars, artisans, and poets who had made Prospero a haven of culture, were slaughtered indiscriminately. They did not fight back. They obeyed their Primarch. They stood and watched as their world died around them. The Thousand Suns, warriors who had conquered galaxies, could do nothing but bear witness to the murder of their home. The psychic scream of a billion souls being extinguished at once washed over them, a wave of agony that buckled the knees of even the most stoic Astartes. This was not a censure. This was not justice. This was extermination. It was a pogrom from orbit, a declaration that not only their practices, but their very existence, was a heresy to be scoured from the memory of the galaxy. The Space Wolves were not merely destroying a city. They were burning a library, the greatest library the Imperium had ever known. They were murdering knowledge itself. And still, the Thousand Suns held their ground, their faith in their Primarch's wisdom, the only shield they had left. When the bombardment finally ceased, it was only to make way for the invasion. Drop pods fell like iron rain, scything through the smoke-choked atmosphere. From them emerged the gray-clad warriors of Fenris, their axes and bolters hungry for blood. They were a tide of savage fury, a stark and brutal contrast to the refined scholarship of their victims. The wolves charged into the ruins of Tizca, with howls on their lips, their purpose clear. They had come to kill every last living thing on this world. It was only then, as the first bolt shell struck the unresisting line of Thousand Suns warriors, as the first chain axe bit into the crimson ceramite of a brother Astartes, that the spell of Magnus's command began to break. The realization dawned with the chilling finality of a death sentence. There would be no trial. There would be no appeal. Their loyalty meant nothing. Their father had sent his hounds to put them down, and there was no reasoning with a rabid dog. The battle for Prospero, when it finally began, was a slaughter. The Thousand Suns were caught utterly unprepared, their command structure shattered, their psychic abilities suppressed by their own Primarch's edict, and the nullfield, projected by the Sisters of Silence, who accompanied the wolves. They were scholars forced into a brawl, philosophers facing butchers. Yet they were still Astartes. They were the sons of Magnus the Red. They fought with a desperate courage born of betrayal, their kind blades and force staves, meeting the howling axes of the Velka Fenrica. But for every wolf they cut down, 3 more seemed to take his place. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and psychically neutered. They died in the ruins of their beautiful city, their crimson armor stained black with their own blood, their last sights the snarling, bestial faces of their brother, Astartes, High in the pyramid of Photep, Magnus watched the psychic reflection of his world's demise. He felt every death, every moment of terror and agony from his people. He had believed in reason. He had believed in his father's ultimate justice. He had been wrong. His passivity had not proven his loyalty. It had only made the massacre easier. The pleas of his surviving sons reached him, most notably those of his first captain, Azek Araman. They begged him to unleash them, to let them fight as they were meant to fight, to use the powers he had taught them to defend their home. To die as scholars was one thing. To be exterminated like vermin without raising a hand was another. The choice had been stripped from him. His attempt at martyrdom had failed. All that was left was survival. In the depths of his despair, a new voice whispered to him from the great ocean. A voice that had been watching, waiting. A voice that offered power. The power to save what little remained of his legion. The voice of Tzinch, the architect of fate. With a roar of psychic grief and rage that cracked the very foundations of his pyramid, Magnus the Red unleashed his full power. The sky above Tizca, already dark with smoke, now swirled with the impossible colors of the Imperium. The Edict of Nikaea was burned away by the sheer force of his will. He reached out to his scattered sons, not with a command to surrender, but with a call to war. Fight, his voice thundered in their minds. Fight and live. Across the burning city, the 1,000 suns rose. Their eyes blazed with empiric light. The raw power of the warp, so long suppressed, surged through them. Flesh changed. Armor warped into new, impossible shapes. Bolts of pure psychic energy tore through the ranks of the astonished space wolves. They had come to execute witch, and now, in their final moments, the 1,000 suns became the very monsters their murderers had always believed them to be. They had been loyal. They had been obedient. They had been sacrificed on the altar of a lie. Now there was nothing left but the fight. The ensuing battle was no longer a simple massacre. It was an apocalyptic confrontation between two opposing philosophies of war. The raw, kinetic fury of the space wolves against the protean, reality-bending power of the 1,000 suns. The ground turned to glass. The air crackled with raw power. Astartes, who had been brothers, now fought with a hatred reserved for the most alien of foes. Magnus himself descended from his pyramid, a giant of crimson and gold, his single eye weeping tears of fire. He strode through the battlefield like a vengeful god, his psychic might turning swathes of Fenrisian warriors to dust and ash. He sought out his brother, Leman Russ, the Wolf King, the instrument of his damnation. Their duel was a clash of titans, a battle that shook the foundations of the dying world. But it was too late. Prospero was already lost. The libraries were ash, the civilians dead, the dream of Tizca broken forever. In the end, what remains is the tragedy. Magnus, facing ultimate defeat, his back broken by Russ, made a final pact. To save the last remnants of his legion, he surrendered them to the power that had offered him salvation. He transported the pyramid of Photep and the few thousand surviving 1,000 suns, not to another star system, but into the warp itself, to the planet of the sorcerers, a world waiting for them in the domain of Tzinch. They did not fall to chaos. They were pushed. They were driven from the light by those who claimed to serve it. The space wolves had won. They had followed their orders. They had purged the unclean. But in doing so, they had committed one of the foundational crimes of the Horus Heresy. They had destroyed a loyal legion, murdered a faithful Primarch's people, and turned a brother who had tried to save the Imperium into an enemy who would seek to destroy it for 10,000 years. The burning of Prospero was the moment the Great Crusade truly died. It was the moment the Imperium's promise of an enlightened future gave way to a new age of fear, superstition, and ignorance. It was proof that the greatest threat to humanity was not the alien or the demon, but humanity itself. The ashes of Tizca were a funeral pyre for reason. And as the last of the wolves departed the dead world, they left behind not a victory, but a silent, smoking testament to the fact that the first great blow of the war for humanity's soul was struck not by the hand of a traitor, but by the fist of a loyalist. The galaxy would burn for 10 millennia because of this single unforgivable act of betrayal, this lie that was allowed to become truth. And now as darkness closes once more upon the galaxy, the echoes of that lie still resonate, a quiet, ominous warning that the most terrible monsters are often the ones who believe they are the heroes.